people do not fully understand the difference between an allegory and an application. Many people apply the ring to the nuclear bomb, don't they? I think that it was in my mind that the whole thing is an allegory. But it isn't.
On January 25th, 2024, user 4 of Clubs posed this seemingly simple question to the True Films subreddit. How do you become film literate? 4 of Clubs goes on to explain their struggle to figure out what a movie is really about. They feel as though, in the moment, they're able to boil a film down to what it all meant, only to realize later, after watching analysis videos, that their assumptions about the film's meaning were way off. They then cap off the post by asking how everyone else seems to get it right when they themselves can't. Again, how do you become film literate? The top comment on this post from user Cup of Tea on Me begins with the following. First off, and I can't stress this enough, don't watch video analyses or video essays in order to become film literate. There are many great video essays about movies out there, but in general, it's a format that prizes explanation via illustration over actual artistic analysis, which is where proper literacy emerges. Now you're probably thinking, given that this is a video essay, that I am probably about to go on some huge rant about how this absolutely isn't true, and that videos like mine are a great resource for teaching film literacy, but I actually kind of agree with this person. And the reason why I agree is because of The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, specifically Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, is a trilogy of films that only becomes more meaningful to me over time. As the years roll by, I find myself increasingly swept away by them emotionally, and I always walk away from each rewatch with even more to appreciate. Yet, over that same course of time, even as my critical faculties have continued to develop, I've had an increasingly difficult time explaining why, which is a bit of a conundrum for me, given that explaining why a film does or doesn't resonate with me is kind of a huge part of my life. Admittedly, saying that I'm not able to explain why is a tiny bit of an oversimplification of the problem here, because it's actually quite easy to tell people why The Lord of the Rings means so much to so many, myself included, especially if you're talking about the films. Using the foundation of Tolkien's dense world building and lore, as well as his iconic characters and a faithful retelling of their incredible journey, the films build upon that with kinetic and invigorating directing, highly detailed and thoughtful scripts, pitch-perfect performances, top-class visual effects work and costuming, and one of the most beautiful scores ever composed in the history of film, which all combines to create a sweeping epic that was previously thought impossible. It's a monumental, lightning in a bottle type of achievement that'll never be recreated no matter how hard the rights holders may try. That's why The Lord of the Rings is so meaningful. So why do I still kind of feel empty inside? Truth be told, despite the fact that I meant every word of what I just said, it doesn't feel very gratifying to sit here and tell an audience of people what they already know. Those observations are ones that have been repeated over and over again for the past 2 decades. What I, as a YouTube video essayist, want to do is to look past all that obvious stuff and tell you what those films really mean. To dig myself further and further into a rabbit hole and eventually emerge with the truth hidden below. The truth that everyone else stopped short of, like that stupid-ass digging for diamonds meme. But it seems the more I ponder the question, what does The Lord of the Rings really mean, the more I find myself questioning whether The Lord of the Rings really means anything at all. Obviously, it has to mean something, right? Otherwise, why would I return to the films year after year? Why would I emotionally attach myself to them so much? And Why on earth would I do a stupid amount of research in an attempt to come up with an explanation? When I was much younger, I had what I thought was a pretty solid idea of why this particular story was so meaningful. I believed the key to truly understanding The Lord of the Rings was framing it through J.R.R. Tolkien's service in World War I. I thought with absolute certainty that Tolkien had very deliberately and inextricably written his experience of fighting in the Great War into the world of Middle-earth, that his small cast of hobbits were meant to represent himself and his brothers in arms in the trenches, that the conflict of Middle-earth was a direct stand-in for the conflicts of Allied and Central powers, and that Frodo's journey was ultimately one that told of a physically and emotionally wounded veteran, yearning, yet ultimately failing, to return to a normal life after the war. But then a really big Tolkien fan very gently and kindly let me know that Tolkien would have absolutely fucking hated that interpretation. Not only did Tolkien once blatantly state in a letter to L.W. Forster that he didn't believe the events of either World War I or II had any influence on the overall plot of Lord of the Rings, but he also repeatedly and very openly opposed the idea that The Lord of the Rings is meant to be a one-to-one representation of anything from reality. In his foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author." And it was this short paragraph that sent me into the spiral that is the video you're about to watch. And as always, it all began with a seemingly simple question. Allow me to indulge in an incredibly annoying video essay trope here for just a second. If we quickly Google the definition of allegory, we get the following: a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. But, as always, a quick Google search does not tell the whole story. Even when just looking at this simplistic definition, things start to become pretty vague once you emphasize the "can be interpreted" part. Can't any story, poem, or picture theoretically be interpreted by someone to reveal a hidden meaning, even if there isn't one? How do we distinctly tell an allegory apart from other methods of storytelling or interpretation? Well, as it turns out, answering these questions is kind of hard to do. In preparation for this video, I read a few books on the subject, yay me, and the most basic yet important distinction between what I've read and the simple Google definition is this: allegory is not one thing. It is not simple or easily categorizable. It's, ironically, given Tolkien's pitting of the two against each other, highly applicable to many different forms. If you were to ask American poet and Harvard/Brown University professor Edwin Honig, author of Dark Conceit, The Making of Allegory, he'd likely tell you that allegory is defined contextually by form, genre type, and style, as well as the form of the medium conveying it, and that allegory is a totally achieved literary creation. But then, if you asked Gary Johnson, assistant professor of English at the University of Findlay and author of The Vitality of Allegory, he would disagree with the notion that allegory has to encompass an entire piece of artistic work, and instead prefers to define allegory by its different types or styles, to try and give people a better way to talk about allegory without being reductive. And then there's Teresa Kelly, professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and author of Reinventing Allegory, who made a similar argument before Johnson's book was published, concluding that the reason Allegory has survived as long as it has is because of its ability to adapt itself over time to the hostile cultural climates surrounding it, dating all the way back to the 1500s. That's right, Tolkien's 1966 complaint about Allegory is just a small drop in the bucket that is a centuries-long debate about Allegory's purpose of existence. The point of that overload of information being that it's a lot of information and can easily become overwhelming. Trust me on that one. And unfortunately, in the United States, according to the National Literacy Institute, 54% of adults have a literacy below a 6th grade level. So, despite the wealth of valuable information from scholars telling me not to do this, I am now going to explain what Allegory is in the most reductive way possible. Imagine for a moment a screenwriter. Maybe their name is David, or Lowell, or Babalu, or something. Doesn't really matter. They're in their office about to begin writing a brand new story, and they think to themselves, the US healthcare system sucks ass. Hey, they said it, not me. So then they decide, hey, I'm here, I'm ready to write, so why don't I try to write a story that can explain why the US healthcare system sucks so much ass? Maybe it'll help people who may not fully understand the concept otherwise. Maybe this story will give the hardworking people of this country some hope. Maybe I can teach them that they can fight for a better future. And what will this story of theirs be called? Well, we'll just call it Robots, the 2005 animated children's film. This is kind of a known meme. Don't take this too seriously. Let's just have some fun here. So anyway, this screenwriter starts coming up with some characters who are meant to personify the abstract concepts they're trying to convey. Naturally, they make a couple characters that are meant to represent, in their view, the US healthcare system. They call these characters Ratchet and Madam Gasket, and through these characters, the screenwriter personifies concepts like corporate greed, elitism, and exploitation of the working class. So, who is their protagonist? Remember that protagonist does not mean hero, so theoretically, one of these US healthcare personifications they've come up with could be the protagonist, but it's a lot easier to just make those characters the antagonists given what they're trying to convey with the story. So, maybe the main character is their exact opposite, like an impoverished person struggling with some type of illness. But wait, this screenwriter thinks, let's be real here for a second. An impoverished person with chronic health issues does not need to be convinced that the healthcare system sucks ass. They already know that. So instead, they make the protagonist a lower middle class person, just privileged enough to naively believe in the optimistic nature of capital and entrepreneurship, but not so privileged that they're blind to the struggles of the working class. Then, finally, the screenwriter constructs the plot of the story around these conceptual characters, and it goes a little something like this. Our lower middle class dreamer goes to the big city to try and break into big business, but runs into our antagonistic US healthcare characters and is flatly rejected by them. You cannot work here, your ideas are stupid. But not ready to pack up and go home, this leaves our main character out on the streets, where they meet a ragtag group of impoverished people who are all struggling, health-wise or otherwise, for one reason or another. Our protagonist, using their skills and access to limited resources, begins helping these impoverished people, and slowly the number of people they're able to help grows and grows until they're helping out an entire community's worth of people. Antagonist healthcare characters catch wind of this and do what they would do and try to eradicate this population of people, but with the community's support and by utilizing the antagonist's own forces of production against them, our protagonist is able to overcome the evil and create a better future for all. The end. That story, in its totality, through its collection of deliberately utilized tropes and identifiable markers like personification, transfiguration, or the lessons and wisdom that it imparts, and its poetic irony. That is an allegory. And the confusing thing is, sometimes not all the pieces of an allegory fit together perfectly. Sometimes you get a character that completely messes up the entire point of the story just by existing, and sometimes you get a farting robot woman with a gigantic ass because reasons. Point being, an allegory doesn't necessarily have to be the totally achieved literary creation that Honig envisioned, which sometimes makes it more difficult to tell whether or not something is even meant to be seen as an allegory at all. A gigantic wrench in the works of us memers proclaiming robots is meant to be some kind of socialist allegory is that allegory often requires being written deliberately. It's kind of a hard thing to pull off if the author isn't doing it intentionally, and we don't really have any proof that robots is meant to be an allegory. Again, it's just kind of a shitpost. All I know is that robots fits the typical tropes, and like Google said, it can be interpreted to reveal a hidden, mostly political meaning, and that it's just a really effective example when trying to communicate how an allegory typically looks and functions. But essentially, what I did in order to try and convey that to you, as all of us have, is reverse engineer the process of allegory, to look at the story in totality and travel backwards, breaking down its individual components until we reach the lesson at its core, a process that I think comfortably fits the definition of Allegoresis. Allegoresis is something that us YouTube video essayists are no stranger to. That's what a lot of people watch a video like this for. When I try to find out what The Lord of the Rings really means, I am indulging myself in Allegoresis. Morton Bloomfield, in his article Allegory as Interpretation, states that most scholars and literary critics are allegorists. If we interpret a work of art, we are seeking its significance, either historically or ahistorically. And this comes with a lot of benefits. For many people, an allegorical interpretation can finally explain their love of a piece of art and why they connect with it so much. To others, it illuminates a deeper perspective they might have missed in their own viewing. But unfortunately, Allegoresis also comes with the baggage of the centuries-long debate surrounding allegory, including the objections by one J.R.R. Tolkien. One of the most common complaints about allegory is how contrived it can feel. The characters seem to cease acting naturally and instead rigidly conform to whatever other thing they are meant to represent, whether that be a concept, a deity, a moral value, a system, whatever. And through that contrivance, allegory opposes a realistic or natural view of the world, or in Tolkien's view, it opposes history. Another major complaint about allegory throughout the ages that I'll probably see quite a bit in the comments section of this video is that allegory is far too preachy, feeling more like a sermon or a piece of propaganda than an engaging narrative. Now, I can't exactly prove this, but I do feel that a big reason for this complaint existing into the modern day is because of how much we associate allegory with children's media. Obviously, I used robots as an example of what an allegory, quote-unquote, is. In The Vitality of Allegory, Gary Johnson spends a good portion of an early chapter talking about a children's storybook called Coco the Carrot, and when trying to explain cultural mentalities about allegory's rigidness as an art form, the example Teresa Kelly reaches for is the brave little toaster. I'm not suggesting that our cultural linking of allegory with children's media is the entire reason why people tend to dislike it so much, but I do feel it only adds fuel to the fire of the long-standing belief that allegory talks down to its audience. Even Tolkien, when asked about whether he enjoyed the Chronicles of Narnia, written by his friend C.S. Lewis, said, "The answer is no. I do not like allegory, and least of all, religious allegory of this kind." According to an article by Professor David C. Downing on the official C.S. Lewis website, Tolkien's reasoning behind this was that he, quote, found the stories too hastily composed and too didactic. Didactic meaning, of course, morally instructive, usually in a patronizing way. And that all of this, when combined, forced the story into an essentially authoritarian view, as Tolkien put it, the purposed domination of the author. And where Allegoresis, aka allegorical interpretation, is concerned as far as how Tolkien felt about it, the same article highlights that, quote, Tolkien heartily disliked allegory, and he strenuously objected whenever readers tried to translate his Middle-earth tales into either theological or historical parables. Much to Tolkien's dismay, however, The Lord of the Rings has continually been allegorized, especially historically. Since the books were written over the course of World War II, many assumed that the books were consciously reflecting on that in an allegorical way, that the ring was meant to represent the nuclear bomb. Others assumed, like I did, that the books were some autobiographical tale about World War I disguised as fantasy. Even when the Lord of the Rings films began to release starting in 2001, apparently many made the assumption that the films were not just an allegory for war in the Middle East, but that it was an allegory that was strictly pro-American.
You were obviously making a political statement with your t-shirt.
I wouldn't normally, but it's sort of a reaction to, I've heard a lot of people say to me, and I've read in a lot of places about the first movie and increasingly about the second one. I've seen where people try to relate it to, the current situation, specifically the United States and their role in the world right now. I don't think that the Two Towers, or Tolkien's writing, or Peter's work, or our work has anything to do with the United States foreign adventures. In the Two Towers, you have different races, nations, cultures coming together, examining their conscience and unifying against a very real and terrifying enemy. What the United States has been doing for the past year is bombing innocent civilians without having come anywhere close to catching Osama bin Laden or any presumed enemies. And I don't think that the civilians on the ground in those countries look at us in the way that maybe Europeans did, at the end of World War II, waving flags in the streets. I think that they see the U.S. government as Saruman.
And again, I'm not immune to this. Even after denouncing a strictly historical interpretation, I still find myself allegorizing Lord of the Rings. A particularly blatant example of something within Lord of the Rings that I feel very much exudes the tropes of allegory, so much so to me that it's impossible to ignore, is the last march of the Ents. In the Two Towers, there's these giant creatures called Ents, who are, for all intents and purposes, anthropomorphized trees, or at least they are in the movies. I know the lore is dense, you goddamn nerds. I love you. The Ents eventually learn that Saruman, the White Wizard who used to be friends with them, has killed many trees in the name of fueling the fiery machine of war. The Ents, deeply upset by this great loss, flood Isengard, Saruman's fortress, effectively destroying not only his means of producing weapons and soldiers, but also robbing him of protection from outside harm. It is incredibly difficult, given the way this event is told, not to see it as allegorical. We have the Ents, personifying figures meant to represent nature, pitted against Saruman and his forces, resembling rampant industrialization. The story that is told then tells us that nature will prevail over industry, that nature will reclaim itself and destroy us before we are allowed to destroy nature. There's even the typical hint of irony given that Saruman's fortress is ultimately destroyed by the very thing he used to fuel it. By every imaginable definition, this is an allegory. one that may even fit Gary Johnson's description of embedded allegory. Quote, "We repeatedly encounter texts in which extended metaphors, parables, fables, dreams, and the like are unmistakably meant or are made to be representative of the larger primary narrative. When looking at the Shire as our starting point and Mordor as the end point, and comparing that timeline with the embedded allegorical tale of The Last March of the Ents, it's difficult not to allow this contrast and comparison to invite allegorical interpretation alongside it. The Shire, through this view, is made to represent the natural green beauty of a simple life, and Mordor is made to represent the oppressive and heartless machinations of war and authoritarianism. These opposing forces are pitted against each other, ultimately toppling in favor of those aligned with the natural world. Through this lens, The Lord of the Rings becomes an allegorical tale about man's attempts to have dominion over nature, telling us that these attempts are futile, that we either fight to protect the natural world or we die with it. This same type of allegorization can even be applied to the basic imagery of Middle-earth. In Teresa Kelly's Reinventing Allegory, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the paintings of J.M.W. Turner and how they use scale and even historical reference to convey allegorical meaning. Quoting Kelly, "In Turner's art more generally, allegory supervises a complex rhetorical and visual enterprise that is often inseparable from the representation of history as landscape. Because they specify an interpretive logic at odds with realist or naturalist style, gigantism, miniaturization, and related deformations of realist perspective supply the key terms in Turner's allegorical practice." Basically, what is being said there is that by utilizing scale, by growing or shrinking the size of objects and people in an unnatural way, for the purposes of contrasting them with one another within the same frame, the paintings themselves begin to tell an allegorical story. Think David and Goliath, the big versus the small. And this practice is all over The Lord of the Rings, especially in the films. Peter Jackson was incredibly obsessed with scale, utilizing a wide range of techniques to achieve different effects that sell the idea of not only the drastically different sizes of each character, but also the monumentous size of the world that they inhabit. And what we're left with a lot of the time is a strong contrast between large-scale landscapes or overbearing threats and our small cast of heroes, often both literally and figuratively, which works to highlight the near impossibility of this journey, to show how much ground our heroes have to cover, or just how overwhelmingly outmatched they are, which can incite terror and fear, but also works to embody the awe-inspiring fact that our little heroes, despite the impossibility that lay before them, managed to succeed. And this begins to conjure so many allegorical interpretations, mostly the ways in which the small and oppressed will ultimately overcome the large forces that seek to domineer them. It's an incredibly hopeful story of resilience that tells us that, like the characters, we can weather the storm and live to see the sunrise. And we can even start to allegorize the entire story of The Lord of the Rings purely by looking at the One Ring itself. Of course, this calls into question the age-old fight between allegory and symbolism. Even Tolkien's old friend C.S. Lewis got in on this debate, as paraphrased by Morton Bloomfield, quote, "Some critics like C.S. Lewis have attempted to separate the terms allegory and symbolism, reserving the former for what we would call personification allegory." One of the names that got tossed around time and time again in my research was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, arguably the loudest voice in the debate between allegory and symbolism. From Coleridge's point of view, as summarized by Gary Johnson, Allegory, in comparison to the symbol, emerged with the stigma of being less artistic because it is more artificial. In Edwin Honig's Dark Conceit, he quotes Coleridge as saying, "Allegory cannot be other than spoken consciously," whereas with symbolism, it is very possible that the general truth may be unconsciously in the writer's mind during the construction of the symbol. At face value, this seems to be the exact approach that Tolkien took with Lord of the Rings. He, in his own words, thoroughly rejects any conscious effort to make the Lord of the Rings an allegory. Symbolism, when looked at from Coleridge's perspective, seems to take on a lot of Tolkien's view of applicability, especially when looking at the One Ring. It is obviously symbolically linked to power. It's literally called a ring of power. This power is not made to represent a real-world equivalent like the nuclear bomb, but is instead a symbol which may be applied to whatever powerful force the reader chooses. We could also say that power is the theme of the story, but again, this distinction in terminology gets a bit murky. Going back to the vitality of allegory for a second, Gary Johnson talks about how Gerald Prince argues that theme and allegory are distinct because theme is externally illustrated by a narrative text, whereas an allegory is illustrated internally by the individual elements that form a narrative text. Gary Johnson's example: the character Envy, a textual unit in Langland's Piers Plowman, has a role, literally, in the transformation of the idea of salvation into a narrative, and so it is an element of that allegory, not just an illustration of theme. And that is the exact thing that, for me at least, safely throws away the idea that the ring symbolizes power, or that power is simply a theme of the story. The One Ring is heavily personified. Apparently, how much is the One Ring its own character is a widely contested debate among the fandom, but the films make it clear that the ring has some form of organicness to it, at least more than any ring in reality would.
The ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found.
It abandoned Gollum.
It even changes its size to better suit its wearer, which raises a lot of questions, like, is it fully self-aware, having its own consciousness, or does it simply make decisions unconsciously? Does it have its own will, or is it simply an extension of Sauron's will, etc.? It seems these answers are entirely up to interpretation, but what is largely agreed upon is that the ring is no mere ring. Whether it's simply an extension of Sauron or whether it's its own character entirely doesn't really matter. What matters is that it is a character, because it has the ability to directly influence both the plot and the other characters of the story in ways that a pure piece of symbolism or a demonstration of theme would struggle to. It is a personification, a figuration of the idea of power, one that to me seems entirely allegorical, especially considering how its influence begins to make figurations out of the other characters. Saruman and Sauron himself can be seen as representing the corrupting and authoritarian nature of power to its fullest extent. Gollum becomes emblematic of addiction to power and how it robs people of their humanity. And again, we see some irony through Gollum's journey. As his desperate struggle to reclaim the ring finally ends, so does his life. By extension, Frodo begins to represent innocence and how even the most innocent people can be corrupted by the promise of unadulterated power. Boromir shows us that even with honorable intentions, the driving force behind power is greed, a driving force that no amount of nobility can be made to withstand. Which isn't completely watertight given the fact that Aragorn is crowned as king by the end, but I guess if the Lord of the Rings wiki is anything to go by, his rule as king could be made to resemble unification and shared prosperity, as overly idyllic as that may be under a monarchy. But of course, despite all that sounding nice on paper and hopefully coherent and engaging enough for a YouTube audience, Tolkien would ultimately reject all of these views of Lord of the Rings as being too didactic. He would say none of these allegorical interpretations are the real meaning of Lord of the Rings, but rather me taking his writing and applying it to the outside world. But, as Morton Bloomfield would put it, it is not satisfying to feel that anything can mean anything. Despite Tolkien's view stemming from an intent to give the reader freedom through applicability, as a YouTuber who wants to sit here and tell you what the Lord of the Rings really means, this actually puts me in a pretty restrictive and frustrating position that exposes the holes in both my and Tolkien's entire approach. In Morton Bloomfield's summary of Northrop Frye's writing on Allegory, he states that Frye says the author's whole technique tries to indicate how a commentary on them should proceed. This, he goes on to say, imitates critics because it attempts to prescribe how to interpret a poem. Gary Johnson illuminates this point even further. Quote, Northrop Frye says, the commenting critic is often prejudiced against allegory without knowing the real reason, which is that continuous allegory prescribes the direction of their commentary and so restricts its freedom. For many readers, meaning is still the aim of interpretation. Hence, these readers naturally shy away from anything that smacks of allegory, because in allegory, the author has often made their meaning clear, and an analysis of an allegory in this context might be seen as little more than a literary autopsy. Taking all of that into account, I'm at a bit of an impasse. Trying to discover the true meaning of Lord of the Rings feels a bit like a zero-sum game. Tolkien has inherently prescribed the direction of my commentary because, metatextually, Tolkien is begging me not to make an allegory out of it. And even if I managed to do so, I would then just be passing my own frustrated position down onto my audience, because I'd be selling them a reductive view of how they're supposed to feel about Lord of the Rings, instead of getting them any closer to the answers they came here to find. Nobody wins. But maybe this is exactly how I'm supposed to feel. The difficulty of trying to make this kind of video about Lord of the Rings is that I am repeatedly finding myself slamming into various existential brick walls. There are inherent limitations to just about every medium you can think of, and a video essay is no exception, as the Reddit comment in the beginning of this video illustrates. I find myself, again and again, limited by both the subject matter here and my own ability, much in the way that Teresa Kelly recounts how critics and voices of authority tried to limit allegory, or in the ways that those critics said allegory tried to limit and rigidify truth itself. We're all searching for meaning in a seemingly meaningless world, and allegory is often a very convenient way to construct meaning. Gary Johnson talks a bit about Peter J. Rabinowitz's idea of the authorial audience early on in his book, meaning the hypothetical audience for whom authors have designed their works. Gary Johnson thinks that strong allegories seem to be purpose-made to push readers into this authorial audience because they give readers, quote, clear indications that the author and the author's text are paving a clear path from narrative to authorial reading, essentially meaning that by understanding what a text really means, these readers enter into an exclusive club that understands the work better than anyone else. And what better vantage point is there to make a YouTube video from? I mean, isn't that what I really want out of Tolkien's work by making a video like this? to enter his authorial audience and proudly proclaim that I have it all figured out, and you watching this, maybe you want that too. Maybe if I'm able to gain access to the authorial audience, I can leave a breadcrumb trail for you to follow, and you can be there with both me and the author and with everyone else who really understands the work. There's a sense of connection in that, a sense of purpose. A false sense, but a sense nonetheless. Lately, I've been getting this sort of daunting feeling that a huge reason why I want to enter the authorial audience is more out of fear than anything else. A well-founded fear that one day the people whose art I love will morally fail me. Maybe by allegorizing their art, by picking it apart layer by layer and creating a meta-narrative around it, by attempting to understand just what it was they were really trying to say. I'm actually just trying to find out whether or not the artist is on my side, or whether the art is capable of hurting me should I get too invested. Which becomes a really dangerous game when a work of fiction is all I have to go by. With Tolkien, at least, I have a wealth of published letters that are a lot more useful if I want to figure out whether or not he's a person I resonate with. He was an anarchist, and that's pretty cool to me, I guess, but I'm not really sure how much one can glean just by reading or watching Lord of the Rings, or even by digging into Tolkien's mentalities on how his work should be interpreted. Some of his views seem entirely incompatible to me. For example, Tolkien's view opposes the forces of allegory and history. But what if those forces are exactly the same? Is all of history not just us allegorizing our own existence? Take Edwin Honig's words on the subject. History, as an authentic record of events and persons in the past, becomes authoritative in lending itself to interpretive and moralizing purposes. As soon as the past is recorded and interpreted, it takes on a recreated, almost legendary form in our consciousness of reality. In summarizing Walter Benjamin's work, Teresa Kelly concludes that history and allegory are tied together as ruin, as exposing the fragmentary reality of modern life, a reality which doesn't fit into the streamlined and cohesive narrative that, through hindsight, we sometimes believe it does. Allegory and history both represent the past as a dead possession, a profound truth reduced down to a simplification. Gary Johnson summates American historian Hayden White as having extremely similar views. Quote, White makes the provocative and somewhat contentious claim, at least for other historians, that all narrative works of history must be considered allegorical, because the process of transforming literal events into a narrative requires tropes and figures of thought. A narrative account is always a figurative account, an allegory. From this view, history is much like a paleontologist digging up fossils. The dirt, aka all the particular detail that muddies up the cohesive narrative, is painstakingly brushed away to reveal a rigid form, a fossil, a relic that tells a rather incomplete but seemingly cohesive and all-encompassing story. The scary thing about today, 2024, and probably beyond, is that we don't even have to wait for the passage of time for this once delicate process to begin. As soon as information disseminates, pure fictions, what we call misinformation, make their way into the mix in an attempt to allegorize or otherwise forcefully create a narrative around history in real time. And obviously, this creates an existentially terrifying mess, given how these kinds of allegorical narratives greatly impact how people choose to conduct themselves in the world. This is very much the power of mythology. It's why we expect diligence of everyone who puts their words or worldview out there for all to see, even dealers of fiction. In a world of straight-up lies and deceit, all we want is to be told the truth. But in so much as how allegory, or even this YouTube video itself, attempts to communicate some truth to its audience, we have to consider the fact that language may never actually be able to communicate truth. Words are just indicators of meaning, not meaning in and of themselves. The passage of time and the ever-changing nature of language guarantees that what something really means will be both misunderstood in the future and constantly reinterpreted. Maybe freedom is in accepting that the art we love and our commentary on it don't really mean anything, and by recognizing this, we can, as Teresa Kelly would say, be free from fixed, inflexible codes and receptive to the productive material decay of modern figures. Perhaps allegory and allegoresis don't represent true meaning itself, but rather are just signs that point us in the direction of where the true meaning could possibly be found. I personally have to face the fact that, as a chronic overthinker, I am extremely susceptible to the insidious tactic of what I call engaging to disengage, or what T.S. Eliot may call being distracted from distraction by distraction. Am I really more deeply engaging with a work by picking it apart layer by layer to find some hidden meaning, or am I actually just reflecting on the art over and over again in order to construct a giant kaleidoscopic distraction from the painfully obvious truth in the center? As wannabe Kubrickian Hobbit John Lennon said, looking through a glass onion. This is a video about Lord of the Rings, by the way. The Lord of the Rings might not be an allegory, it might not really mean anything, but it sure means a lot to me. On my recent rewatch, I couldn't help but think about my grandfather every time I saw Bilbo Baggins. Some reasons being surface level, like the fact that they both spoke in English accents, and the fact that this is the most my grandpa shit I've ever heard in my life.
I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve.
Or there's even the fact that my grandfather gifted me a box set of the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings novels when I was very young. So I can't help but think of him every time I think about Lord of the Rings. But the main reason my brain draws this comparison is because my grandfather lived an extremely storied life, unfortunately often to the detriment of his own family. So when Bilbo says this,
I'm sorry that you must carry this burden. I'm sorry for everything.
It hits a little different for me. If I were to sit here and tell you that Bilbo is an allegorical representation of my grandfather, that would sound absurd. But what if I were to say it like this? Bilbo Baggins is a representation of generations past, and how our predecessors, in their pursuit of living an adventurous and self-serving life, ended up passing down the burden of their unfulfilled responsibilities to the generations below them. It is their kin, their children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews who are doomed to pick up the pieces and navigate the difficulties that those before them thought could simply be ignored. By scrubbing this observation of the personal angle and keeping it strictly about the real meaning of Bilbo, suddenly this may seem like some sort of genuine insight about the work itself. I could make an extremely similar argument about how Frodo and Sam's friendship still hits so hard today, because we're all yearning for simple, honest, visceral human connection in an incredibly isolating world. And I'm not arguing that these aren't worthwhile or important pieces of analysis. I actually feel quite the opposite. But I'm just trying to say that maybe it's better for everyone involved to just be honest and upfront about the deeply personal place that this analysis is coming from. That we are constructing meaning around a piece of art, not revealing meaning from within the art itself. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it might even be key to our survival. We live in a very daunting world where it seems impossible not to imagine that nothing really means anything, and in our panic, we scramble to find meaning wherever we can, whether it's the books we read, the films we watch, or even the content we consume. This is what Teresa Kelly calls the dark pathos of allegorical interpretation, the fact that it will and must go on construing meaning and finding patterns in a world where there are no fixed guides. I'm not an authority on anything. My videos, nor anyone else's, can ever contain the truth itself, not even the truth about something as mundane as a film. I cannot illuminate much of anything in a fully transparent way. The best I can do is point people in a direction I feel closest approximates the truth, whatever that is. The illusion of authority often leaves people driving themselves toward extremely rigid worldviews and interpretations in an attempt to make sense of everything, and this applies all the way down to the platform you're currently watching this on. Look again at 4 of Clubs on Reddit, who often felt that no matter how hard they tried to interpret a film, they just couldn't get it right, and so they immediately started looking for guidance instead of recognizing the value of not only their own interpretive voice, but the inherent value of the art they were engaging with. Morton Bloomfield reflects on this quite a bit in the ending of Allegory as Interpretation. He says, "We cannot ignore the literal sense by saying that the allegory says, when it is the literal sense that says. Moreover, the literal is not necessarily concrete, nor the allegory abstract. I should say that the greatness of any work of art lies in the literal sense, that which gives it shape and being. It is the literal sense which is by far the most profound, because it always provides us with a new possibility of interpretation. A work of art is not only what it says, but also what it is." And I have to say that in the place that I'm in right now mentally, I desperately want to believe that. I want to simply just watch Lord of the Rings and feel things, not in a turn my brain off type of way. I'm always going to be thinking about what I'm engaging with, but just in the sense of being appreciative of and occasionally overwhelmed by the inherent meaning of art, and hopefully at some point the inherent meaning of life itself too. In the narrative I construct around my life, I, like Frodo, find myself at odds with the world as it is in front of me, disconnected from it in some vague way, and in my pursuit of driving myself toward what something really means by always yearning for something more, I often paradoxically let so much meaning fall between my fingers until I begin to feel that the only path forward is the one that awaits us all. But maybe it doesn't have to be that way, and maybe allegory is the key. To quote Teresa Kelly one last time, "Working through allegorical images and figures is one way to work things out, reasoning as best we can without having a secure prior knowledge, but with an absolute conviction that roadieing on is the task at hand." And at the end of it all, isn't that what the Lord of the Rings is really about?
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you.